Okay, we're on to the cell respiration part. So this video number 2. I hope these are helpful. It's easier to make them shorter that way. If you want to go back and listen to something again, you don't have to go back and find it in a big long hour-and-a-half video. So now we're going to talk about what are the ways that ATP can be produced. Now, this is a diagram based on the diagram I showed you earlier. Here's ATP, and there is an enzyme called ATPase that splits this into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and a phosphate. And when you do this, and you break this bond off, there's an energy release, and that's what cells use to power their functions. The thing is, to produce ATP also requires energy. So to take that phosphate and to reattach it to an ADP to make ATP also requires energy. So now we're going to talk about the pathways that do that. So a couple of chemistry terms and then some cofactors, and then we'll get to it. In chemistry, in organic chemistry, this term oxidation or oxidizing is a reaction in which electrons are removed from a substance or a carrier molecule or cofactor. Reduction or reducing is a chemical reaction that involves the addition of electrons to a substance or carrier. And I'll show you what that means in a minute. I know it sounds backwards, and it is. If you reduce something, you would think you're taking it away. But in chemistry, when you reduce something, you're adding electrons to it. Carrier molecules. Now, we're going to cover 3 of these. They're called cofactors. Now, I did this so that we wouldn't have to be bouncing back and forth between or going up and down on the outline. But this diagram that I like so much, here's food being broken down and it's being put into the system to produce ATP. There has to be a mechanism to carry the energy produced here, and it's called potential energy, stored energy. You have to keep that energy going through this whole process to produce the adenosine triphosphate molecules. And that's what cofactors do. They're called carrier molecules. And what they do is they carry electrons and donate those electrons to each phase of this entire reaction that's taking place. We're going to talk about, we're going to talk about 3 of those. And here's the first contestant. This is NAD+. See the little plus here? This is actually the oxidized form. It's nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Cool name. Yeah, NAD+ is its oxidized form. It's not carrying electrons. During the process of converting ATP, part of that process is loading up these energy carriers to carry that energy to the next phase of the reaction. So the whole process keeps going. NADH, which is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide dehydrogenase, I just left it as NADH, is its reduced form. And what that means is when you load up NAD plus with electrons, it becomes NADH. And now it's an energy carrier, and it's going to carry that energy / electrons to the next phase of the cycle and donate those electrons. And then once it donates them, it oxidizes, it'll return back to this NAD plus again. This is flavin adenine dinucleotide, FAD plus. Once again, this is the oxidized form. It's not carrying electrons. NADH2, that's dehydrogenase as well, is the reduced form. So this is another carrier molecule that's going to be loaded up during the process along with ATP forming to keep the whole thing. So once again, just keep this in mind. Oops, I'll go over that in a minute. To keep it in mind, that's to keep powering the functions of this whole process to keep the energy going. Think of the bucket brigade. You ever see the movie Fantasia? Little buckets carrying water. That's what these guys are doing. Now, NAD plus. This is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. This one is used in certain anaerobic reactions. It's used during photosynthesis. This is the oxidized version. This is the reduced version when it's been loaded up with electrons and it's ready to carry that energy / electrons to the next part of the reaction. Okay, so the very first stage, well, there's 3 stages of cell respiration. Got to remember, this one occurs in the cytoplasm of a cell. So the kind of this vacant area in a cell, it's not inside a little organelle. It just occurs in the jelly part of a cell. It's called glycolysis. Glyco refers to glucose / glycogen. Lysis, the term lysis means to dissolve. So you're breaking down glucose. Now, you don't have to know this, so I didn't put it in your outline, but glucose is C6H12O6. It's a 6-carbon glucose. During glycolysis, you take glucose and you split it into 2 3-carbon molecules, which is called pyruvate, or pyruvic acid. Now, nothing happens for free. It's kind of hard to say that nowadays, but nothing happens for free. It requires energy. To take a molecule like that and break it into 2 pieces requires 2 ATP molecules. So these are the products of glycolysis. You do get 4 molecules produced in the whole thing, but because it does require 2 to split it in half, you get a net of 2 ATP molecules from glycolysis. Cell can use that for energy. You get 2 pyruvic acid molecules, which are going to go into the next part of this, and then you also get 2 energy carriers, 2 NADH. So that's reduced, and it's loaded up with energy, and it's ready to carry that energy to the next part of the chemical reaction. So here's glycolysis. This represents the addition. Okay, 2 ATPs are needed to break this down into these 2 molecules. So to go from glucose to 2 pyruvic acids cost 2 ATP. This is showing, here is the NADs being loaded up with electrons, so they're being reduced. And there's where the 2 ATPs get formed. And then you end up with 2 pyruvic acids. Those are very important. So that's glycolysis. So that occurs, once again, I don't want to bounce, I was trying not to go up and down. See glycolysis? This happens outside. It's in the cell, but it's in the cytoplasm. All of this part takes place in a mitochondria. Okay, the little organelle I showed you with the folds in it. Okay, on to the next part. So what would happen is these 2 would form, and all of this, we have the energy, okay, the 2 ATPs get used for energy. This part and this part, they participate in what's called the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. And you can see it's one big wheel, and it's actually huge. It takes up an entire wall in small font. Okay, this is a very simple diagram. You don't have to know all of these. Alpha ketoglutarate, this is succinyl-CoA. What happens is the pyruvic acid from the last reaction, it has to be converted into something called acetyl-CoA, or acetyl-coenzyme A, to enter the Krebs cycle. So it gets cleaved up before it enters. So pyruvic acid here, and it says it right here, this occurs in mitochondria, gets converted into this, acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is then broken down just like this. And some of these are enzymes. You end up with this, oxaloacetate. But do you see in the process, here you're getting more energy carriers. See those? There's some NADH that's been reduced. I'm not going to worry about this one. It's just simply the same thing as saying ATP. It's called guanine triphosphate. Here is a flavin, the FAD. See, that gets reduced. Some more energy carriers. And then you get another one here. So the products of the citric acid cycle from one pyruvate, and I kind of wish I should just put a pyruvic acid here to there to that. But one turn through this whole cycle, you end up with 2 carbon dioxide molecules. That's a normal byproduct of aerobic respiration. You breathe that off when you exhale. You get an ATP. You get these 4 energy carriers and some hydrogen ions. Okay, that's really not a lot, but that's okay because you're building up for the big end of this thing. So just keep this in mind. So, I keep wanting to click on that. Here's glycolysis. Remember, it got split into two pyruvic acids. Both of those get converted into this. They go through this cycle. You get some more energy carriers. Okay, you get some byproducts. So you're going to get some water. You'll get a lot of things. You get a lot of byproducts. Now, this is the end of this thing. Now, I tried to find another diagram. I like this one because it looks like, and it is, see how this is kind of like a little waterfall cascade thing? And you can even see it here. Look, here's the FAD unloading its electrons. It's powering this process. Here's the NAD. Look, see the arrow? It's being oxidized. It's dumping its electrons into this to keep this whole thing going. And then you can see the ATP being generated. And you're also getting some hydrogen ions here. So this is called the electron transport chain. And I thought I had that. I guess it's on the bottom here. So this is the electron transport chain. Yeah, look at all of these enzymes. And I was talking about cyanide earlier. Right in here, there's an enzyme called cytochrome C oxidase. Cyanide blocks it right there. So a person doesn't produce any energy. This whole thing stops it right there. Okay, so this whole cascade of reactions is happening, and then you can't really see it, but this little guy here, very important, that's oxygen. You know, we are aerobic organisms, human beings. There are bacteria that are aerobes. Animals, well, the whole kingdom, Eukarya, we're under, they're all aerobes. They require oxygen. Oxygen that you breathe has to be sitting right here for this last little chemical reaction. And what ends up happening is 2 hydrogens, and see it says it gets reduced, you get this oxygen added, and you get water in the process. And by doing that, it allows this whole chemical reaction to finish. Oxygen is called the last electron acceptor. So all these electrons from these energy carriers are being dumped into this, and they all come down here. Oxygen is there waiting, and that's why you breathe. And if you can't breathe and you got no oxygen, then your body's not going to convert energy because it's not going to be there to accept the electrons at the very end of this thing. And that's a pretty interesting point. It says scientists think that a person will synthesize their body weight in ATP. There is a thing called entropy, which is the amount of disorder within a system. None of this is 100%. You're not getting 100% transfer from any of this. You lose some as heat, water, carbon dioxide. So you're not getting 100%. But all right, here are the products of the electron transport chain. You get some reduced NAD+, and up here you did get a reduced FAD+ as well. It says 1 H2O molecule. Yeah, you know, sometimes you'll see just H2O, and you get about 34 ATP. It does depend on what organism it is, but that's a good number to stay with. So in the very end, this whole thing, glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport, the cleaving of pyruvic acid to make acetyl-CoA to go into this whole thing right here. Here are the end products. From one glucose molecule, during aerobic respiration, you get 36 ATP, all right, 38 if you count glycolysis. And that I'm just saying, well, I'm going to change that, but it's 36 to 38. It depends on the organism. You get some water, some CO2, and like it says there, this all occurs in the mitochondria of a cell. So all of this occurs in the mitochondria of the cell. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. And I love this diagram. See, here's glycolysis. It says pyruvic acid. There's the 2 ATPs. And here's the 36 from the electron transport chain. Once again, it depends on the organism. I know I had 34 up here. And maybe just for easy sake, I'll change that to 36. But it does depend on, the organism. But that's it. Krebs, electron transport, there's water. That's where oxygen's coming in, and that's where CO2. And if you're talking about human beings and animals, when we breathe off this and that. And we inhale oxygen. What's interesting is plants take this, and they actually give off oxygen, and they produce glucose in the process. So it is one big circle. I'm not going to go into the circle of life song from the Lion King, but it's very relevant. All right. Last thing, and I'm going to end this video. This is very quick. Fermentation is also a way of saying anaerobic respiration. Protozoans and bacteria, bacteria and yeast. Yeast is a fungus. They ferment. It's also used in humans sometimes, but it means converting energy without oxygen. Very simple process. Remember glycolysis, here's glucose being split into 2 pyruvic acids. And those pyruvic acids would be converted into acetyl-CoA, and it would go through that whole thing I just showed you. Anaerobic respiration is where the pyruvic acid does not get converted into acetyl-CoA, and it doesn't go through this whole process. So this whole thing of going from here all the way through this, that does not involve oxygen. Anaerobic doesn't go through this pathway. It's much faster. It's much less efficient. But there are times where, like in my earlier video, I showed people sprinting. If you're doing something at high intensity, to go from this to this to that to this to this actually takes a lot of time on a chemistry level. If you can imagine, see all this mess? I mean, look at all these reactions. These are all chemical reactions. They all require enzymes. There's the whole citric acid or Krebs cycle. And so if you're doing something at high intensity, your body, the work output cannot be matched by the energy input. It takes too long. So what happens is, if you're doing something, if a human being is doing something at a high rate, they switch to what's called the anaerobic pathway. There's no oxygen used. And this pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid. If you're talking about some other organisms, it gets converted actually into ethanol. There are some organisms that convert it into a different kind of acid, but that's very simple process where this is pyruvic acid is essentially converted into lactic acid. And lactic acid is the burning in human beings in your muscles. And it will slow you down eventually. And you're using up a ton of energy. Well, you're doing a lot of energy, you're not getting, and you're using up a lot of glucose to produce very little energy. So here are the products of anaerobic respiration. You get 2 ATP molecules. Sometimes you'll get 3. It actually costs 2, remember, to go from here to here. So, I mean, you get 4, but you get a net of 2. Alcohol or ethanol, there's a yeast called a Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It converts barley and hops into alcohol. That's where beer and wine come from. You get carbon dioxide or lactic acid. Some microbes produce acid and CO2 here, but human beings, we produce lactic acid. And there are certain substances, sometimes when people, they have a yeast infection, they'll even produce alcohol. But it occurs in the cytoplasm of a cell, not inside the organism of the cell. It's driven by enzymes as well. It is. So that's called anaerobic respiration or fermentation. it's for high intensity exercise. It's because the work output is so fast and so hard the body can't match the demands for that with aerobic respiration. So it switches to this. You get very quick energy, but you're going to fatigue faster. So the rule of thumb is, if you're running or walking and you can talk while you're doing it, you are in this pathway. If you can carry on a conversation, you're not taxing the body enough to where the work output cannot be met by the energy input. If you start going to a point where your body's going too fast and you're getting out of breath, you're switching to the anaerobic pathway. And that's anaerobic respiration. At some point, you will get fatigued and you'll slow down. The more fit a person is, the faster they can go without dipping into this part of their chemical pathways. All right, so here's a nice summary. Here's glucose. See, here's the 2 ATP required for that. You get 4 produced, but remember it costs you 2, so you get a net of 2 here. This is the aerobic pathway, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. Here are the products. Here's the products of anaerobic fermentation. You get lactic acid or ethanol and 2 ATP molecules. Sometimes, depending on what book you read, it may say 3. And you can get some carbon dioxide too, but not very much. All right, that's the end of this video.